For millennia, the shifting sands of Mesopotamia held a secret etched in clay. According to the oldest written records known to humanity, a cataclysmic deluge once swept across the earth, erasing civilizations and reshaping the cradle of life. The Sumerian king list and the Epic of Atrahasis tell a story that extends beyond a natural disaster. They describe the Anunnaki, a group of celestial entities who, in the aftermath of the rising waters, supposedly returned to the terrestrial realm to reestablish the foundations of order. As we examine these ancient cuneiform scripts, we confront a complex tapestry of architectural marvels, sophisticated agricultural techniques, and governing laws that emerged from the silt. Today, we delve into the archaeological and literary evidence of this post-flood era, exploring what these figures left behind and how their influence continues to echo through the corridors of human history. To understand the world that emerged after the deluge, we must first cast our gaze backward, toward a time when the boundaries between the terrestrial and the celestial were perceived as far more permeable than they are today. In the Fertile Crescent of what is now modern Iraq, the ancient Sumerians recorded a history that begins not with the rise of nomadic tribes, but with the descent of divine beings. This era, often referred to as the antediluvian period, represents the foundational layer of human civilization as it was understood by the earliest chroniclers of Mesopotamia. The term antediluvian literally translates to before the flood, and in the Sumerian worldview, it was a golden age of direct intervention and guidance by the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki, a name that translates to those of princely seed or those who from heaven came to earth, were not merely distant objects of worship. According to the cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of cities like Nineveh and Nippur, these entities were the architects of the first urban centers. They were the masters of science, the distributors of law, and the custodians of the cosmic order. The records suggest that the Anunnaki established 5 primary cities before the waters rose to consume the earth. These were Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larsa, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city was designated as a seat of power for a specific deity, and each served as a laboratory for the development of what we now recognize as the hallmarks of civilization. The Sumerian king list, perhaps one of the most enigmatic documents in the history of archaeology, provides a chronological framework for this era. It begins with the profound assertion that kingship was lowered from heaven. This statement is critical because it suggests that the concept of social hierarchy and centralized governance was not a human invention, but a divine gift. The king list records reigns of staggering duration. For example, Alulim is said to have ruled Eridu for 28,800 years, while his successor, Alalngar, reigned for 36,000 years. To a modern historian, these numbers appear fantastical, yet within the context of the Sumerian record, they signify a period of immense stability and the presence of beings whose biological or temporal reality far exceeded that of modern humans. Central to this pre-flood world was the concept of the me. In Sumerian theology, the me were a set of divine decrees or physical objects that functioned as the fundamental blueprints of civilization. They encompassed everything from the art of writing and the craft of metalworking to the more abstract concepts of truth, justice, and the rights of priesthood. These were the tools that the Anunnaki used to organize the chaotic world into a functioning society. The possession of the me granted a city or a god the authority to rule and the technological capability to thrive. When we look at the rapid advancement of Sumerian society, from simple agrarian settlements to complex city-states with advanced irrigation, mathematics, and astronomy, the ancient texts point directly to these divine prototypes as the catalyst. The hierarchy of the Anunnaki was led by a triad of supreme deities who governed different realms of existence. And the sky god, was the nominal head of the pantheon, representing the source of all authority. Beneath him was Enlil, the lord of the air and the wind, who acted as the executive power on earth. Enlil was often depicted as a stern administrator, concerned with the maintenance of order and the enforcement of the divine will. Then there was Enki, the god of the subterranean waters and the master of wisdom and craftsmanship. Enki is frequently portrayed as the benefactor of humanity, the one who interceded on behalf of mortals and provided them with the knowledge necessary to survive in a harsh environment. This dynamic between Enlil and Enki is essential to understanding the events that led to the Great Flood. The records suggest that as human populations grew and their activities became louder and more disruptive, Enlil grew dissatisfied. The noise of humanity was said to disturb his sleep, a poetic way of describing a growing friction between the divine order and the burgeoning human experience. Enlil eventually advocated for the destruction of mankind, viewing the experiment as a failure or a nuisance. However, Enki, the creator and protector of humans, sought a way to preserve the seed of humanity and the knowledge that had been painstakingly bestowed upon them. The antediluvian horizon was thus characterized by a delicate balance between the divine and the human. Humans were created, according to the Atrahasis epic, to relieve the lesser gods of their heavy labor. They were the maintainers of the canals and the tillers of the soil, ensuring that the offerings reached the temples of the Anunnaki. This relationship was symbiotic. The gods provided the framework of civilization, the laws, and the technology, while humans provided the labor and the worship that sustained the earthly residences of these beings. The architecture of this period reflected this cosmic hierarchy. The ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid, was not merely a temple but a bridge between worlds. It was designed to be a dwelling place for the god of the city, a place where the divine could descend and interact with the high priest. The presence of these structures across the Mesopotamian plain serves as a silent witness to a time when the sky gods were believed to walk among men. The ruins of Eridu, considered the oldest city in the world by the Sumerians themselves, reveal layers of temple construction that date back to the earliest reaches of the Ubaid period, suggesting that the memory of these divine foundations is rooted in an incredibly ancient archaeological reality. As we examine the artifacts left behind, we see the influence of the Anunnaki in the very way the Sumerians measured time and space. The sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, which gives us our 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle, is a direct legacy of this era. The Sumerians attributed their sophisticated understanding of the cosmos to the teachings of the gods. They tracked the movements of the planets, predicted eclipses, and understood the precession of the equinoxes long before the invention of the telescope. This sudden emergence of high-level mathematics and astronomy remains one of the great mysteries of human history, often referred to as the Sumerian problem. The shadows of the sky gods were long and enduring. In the centuries leading up to the flood, the Anunnaki were said to have established the first libraries and schools. They taught the art of healing through both herbal medicine and what we might today call ritual psychology. They established the first legal codes, emphasizing that the strong should not oppress the weak, a concept that would later influence the Code of Hammurabi. The antediluvian world was not a primitive one. In the eyes of the Sumerians, it was the pinnacle of human existence, a time when the wisdom of the heavens was directly accessible. However, this era was not to last. The growing tension within the divine council and the shifting environmental conditions of the ancient Near East were converging toward a catastrophic conclusion. The records tell us that the signs of the coming storm were ignored by many, but not by all. The archives of the antediluvian kings contain warnings and premonitions of a great cleansing that would wash away the works of the gods and the lives of men. The horizon was darkening, and the shadows of the Anunnaki were beginning to stretch across a world that was about to be irrevocably changed. The legacy of this period is preserved in the clay tablets that survived the water and the passage of millennia. These texts do not describe the gods as metaphors or psychological archetypes, but as physical realities with distinct personalities, agendas, and technologies. Whether one views these accounts as literal history, sophisticated mythology, or a memory of a lost high civilization, the impact of the antediluvian Anunnaki is undeniable. They provided the template for everything that followed, leaving behind a blueprint of civilization that would eventually rise again from the mud and silt of the receding waters. As we move forward in our investigation, we will see how this blueprint was carried through the storm, and what the Anunnaki chose to leave behind in the wake of the greatest catastrophe the world had ever known. To understand what was left behind, we must first understand what was intended to be destroyed. In the ancient Mesopotamian records, specifically the Atrahasis epic and the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Great Flood is not depicted as a random natural disaster. Instead, it is described as a calculated administrative decision handed down by the highest echelons of the Anunnaki leadership. To the academic historian, these texts provide a window into how the Sumerians perceived the relationship between divine authority and human existence. The narrative begins in the centuries leading up to the cataclysm, a period when humanity had multiplied significantly. According to the tablets, the clamor of mankind became so great that it disturbed the sleep of Enlil, the lord of the air and the primary executive of the Anunnaki Council. In the Sumerian worldview, Enlil represented order, authority, and the preservation of the cosmic balance. To him, the increasing noise and potential for rebellion among the human population were signs of a system that had grown out of control. After several failed attempts to reduce the population through famine and plague, Enlil proposed a final solution: a global deluge that would wipe the slate clean. This decree was not met with unanimous approval. Enki, the lord of the earth and the god of wisdom and subterranean waters, was the primary architect of humanity. In the cuneiform records, Enki is often portrayed as the scientist or the engineer of the gods. He viewed humanity as his greatest achievement and a necessary workforce for maintaining the earthly realm. While the Council of the Gods was sworn to secrecy regarding the coming flood, Enki found a loophole. He did not speak directly to the human hero, known as Ziusadra or Atrahasis, but instead whispered the warning to the wall of Ziusadra's reed hut. He instructed the wall to tear down the house and build a boat, specifically a massive vessel that could carry the seeds of all living creatures. The technical specifications for this vessel, as recorded in the tablets, are remarkably precise. It was to be a giant cube with 7 decks, sealed with bitumen and pitch. This was not merely a boat for survival, it was a mobile laboratory intended to preserve the genetic and cultural blueprints of the pre-flood world. As the storm approached, the Anunnaki themselves prepared to depart. The texts describe the gods retreating to the higher heavens, or the firmament, as the earth below transformed into a chaotic abyss of water. When the heavens finally opened, the description provided by the Sumerian scribes is terrifying in its scale. They write of a black cloud rising from the horizon, of the storm gods Adad and Shulit tearing down the mountains, and of the Anunnaki themselves cowering in fear at the ferocity of the elements. Even the goddess Ishtar is said to have wept, regretting her vote in the council as she watched her children perish in the rising tides. For 7 days and 7 nights the world was submerged. the geographical landscape of the Fertile Crescent, which the Anunnaki had spent millennia cultivating, was erased. The irrigation systems, the ziggurats, and the cities of the antediluvian kings were buried under layers of silt and debris. As the waters began to recede, the vessel eventually came to rest on the peaks of the mountains, traditionally identified as Mount Nimish or the Ararat Range. When Ziusadra emerged to offer a sacrifice, the smell of the burning incense drew the gods back down to earth like flies. It was at this moment that a profound shift occurred in the Anunnaki hierarchy. Enlil was initially furious that any human had survived, but Enki intervened, arguing that the total destruction of humanity would leave the gods with no one to maintain the earth. A new covenant was established. Humanity would be allowed to persist, but with certain limitations placed upon their lifespan and fertility to ensure they never again reached the numbers that had disturbed Enlil. What remains of particular interest to modern scholars is the question of what was physically left behind once the waters vanished. The Sumerian king list provides a vital clue. It explicitly divides history into two eras: the kingship before the flood and the kingship after the flood. The list mentions that after the deluge, kingship was once again lowered from heaven, but it was lowered to a different city, Kish. This suggests that the Anunnaki did not return to the same centers of power. They left behind the ruins of Eridu, Bad Tibra, and Larak, which became sacred archaeological sites for the post-flood Sumerians. More importantly, the Anunnaki left behind the foundation of civilization itself. The Sumerians believed that all the tools of high culture, including writing, mathematics, law, and agriculture, were gifts from the gods that had been preserved through the flood. In the myth of the Seven Sages, or the Apkallu, it is said that these demi-divine beings were sent by Enki to bring the arts of civilization to the post-flood survivors. These sages are often depicted in relief carvings carrying small buckets and pine cones, symbols of the purification and the seeding of knowledge. From an academic perspective, this transition period represents the birth of the historical world. The archaeological record in Mesopotamia does indeed show evidence of massive flooding events, particularly at sites like Shuruppak and Uar, where thick layers of clean clay separate different levels of human occupation. While the scale of these floods is debated, the cultural impact is undeniable. The Anunnaki, whether viewed as literal extraterrestrial beings or as metaphorical representations of natural and social forces, became the silent overseers of a new era. They left behind a blueprint for urban planning and social hierarchy that would define the Near East for thousands of years. The ziggurats built after the flood were not just temples. They were attempts to recreate the mountains where the gods had landed and where humanity had been saved. These structures were designed to bridge the gap between the mundane world and the divine realm, acting as permanent reminders of the time when the heavens had opened and the earth had been reborn. Furthermore, the Anunnaki left behind the concept of the Tablet of Destinies. In the texts, this was a physical object or a set of laws that gave its possessor the power to command the universe and determine the fate of all things. After the flood, the struggle for control over these records became a central theme in Mesopotamian mythology. The idea that there exists a hidden body of knowledge, a set of instructions for the governance of the world, is one of the most enduring legacies of the Sumerian records. As the waters of the deluge dried, the Anunnaki stepped back into the shadows of their temples, leaving humanity to rebuild. But the world they returned to was fundamentally different. The grand infrastructure of the antediluvian age was gone, replaced by the necessity of survival and the slow process of rediscovering the lost arts. The debris of the flood was not just mud and stone. It was the fragments of a higher civilization that the Sumerians would spend the next 3,000 years trying to emulate. The records suggest that the Anunnaki did not leave empty-handed, but they did leave the gate open. They left behind the genetic and intellectual seeds that would eventually sprout into the great empires of Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. By examining these records, we are not just looking at a story of a storm, we are looking at the inventory of a lost world and the beginning of the one we inhabit today. The legacy of the deluge is found in every brick of the Mesopotamian ruins and in every line of cuneiform that survived the silt. It is a story of what was lost, what was saved, and the enduring influence of those who spoke from the heavens before the world was washed clean. The Eridu Genesis remains one of the most vital artifacts of the ancient world. Discovered among the ruins of the holy city of Nippur, this fragmentary clay tablet offers a glimpse into a time when the boundary between the terrestrial and the divine was porous. It is here that we find the earliest structured account of the Great Flood, a narrative that precedes the more famous epic of Gilgamesh and the Book of Genesis. To understand what the Anunnaki left behind, one must first understand the state of the world before the deluge as it was recorded by the Sumerian scribes. The text begins not with destruction, but with the establishment of order. It describes how the gods, known as the Anunnaki, brought the foundations of civilization to the plains of Mesopotamia. This period is referred to as the Antediluvian Age, a time when kingship first descended from heaven. In the Sumerian worldview, the city of Eridu was the first to be established. It was the seat of Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. According to the Eridu Genesis, the gods founded 5 great cities before the floodwaters were ever conceived as a threat. These were Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city was assigned to a specific deity who acted as its patron and protector. These urban centers were not merely places for humans to reside. They were living laboratories where the Anunnaki introduced the Mi, which were the divine decrees or the fundamental blueprints of civilization. The Mi encompassed everything from the art of weaving and metalworking to the complex legal codes and religious rituals that governed society. This celestial wisdom was the primary legacy of the Anunnaki, a collection of technical and ethical knowledge intended to lift humanity out of a primitive state. The kings who ruled these cities were said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. While modern historians interpret these vast spans of time as symbolic or mythological, the Sumerian records present them as historical fact. This discrepancy points to a fundamental aspect of the Anunnaki narrative, the idea that the world before the flood operated under different physical or temporal laws. The rulers were often described as semi-divine figures who acted as intermediaries between the common people and the celestial inhabitants. They were the custodians of the wisdom salvaged from the heavens, and their primary duty was to maintain the irrigation systems and the temples that kept the land fertile and the gods satisfied. However, the Eridu Genesis reveals a growing tension between the creators and their creation. The reasons for the Great Flood in the Sumerian account are somewhat obscured by the broken nature of the tablets, but later versions like the Atrahasis epic clarify that the chief god, Enlil, became frustrated with the noise and overpopulation of humanity. He found their presence disruptive to his rest and convinced the Council of the Anunnaki to wipe out the human race. This decision marks a pivotal moment in the history of the ancient Near East. It represents a shift from the gods as benevolent teachers to the gods as arbitrary judges. It is in this atmosphere of impending doom that we see the first instance of celestial wisdom being salvaged rather than simply bestowed. Enki, the god of the Abzu and the architect of human life, could not sit idly by while his creation was destroyed. Bound by an oath of secrecy, he could not warn the humans directly. Instead, he spoke to the wall of a reed hut where the hero Zayusadra, whose name means he who found long life, was listening. Enki instructed Ziusadra to tear down his house and build a massive boat. Crucially, the boat was to be constructed according to specific geometric proportions provided by the god. This was not just a survival craft, it was a vessel for the preservation of all that had been achieved in the antediluvian age. Ziusadra was commanded to bring his family, the seeds of all living things, and the craftsmen who held the secrets of the me. This detail is essential. The salvage operation was not just about biological survival, it was about the preservation of the intellectual and technological heritage of the Anunnaki. When the storm finally arrived, the Eridu describes a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. For 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land. The Sumerian accounts describe the fury of the winds and the darkness that swallowed the earth. Even the gods themselves were terrified by the scale of the destruction. The text mentions that Inanna, the queen of heaven, lamented the fate of her people, and the other Anunnaki sat in hunger and thirst, realizing that by destroying humanity, they had also destroyed their own labor force and the source of their offerings. This realization is a key theme in Sumerian literature, the interdependence between the divine and the mortal. When the waters finally receded, the boat came to rest, and Ziusadra stepped out to offer a sacrifice. The smell of the roasting meat ascended to the heavens, and the gods gathered like flies around the altar. They were relieved to find that life had survived. The conflict between Enlil and Enki was eventually resolved, and Ziusadra was granted eternal life for his role in saving the human race. But the world he returned to was not the world he had left. The 5 great cities were buried under layers of silt and mud. The divine infrastructure had been swept away, and the direct presence of the Anunnaki on Earth began to diminish. This brings us to the most significant aspect of the ruins mentioned in the Eridu Genesis. The physical ruins were the mounds of mud that had once been Eridu and Sapar, but the more important ruins were the fragments of the me that survived the storm. The post-flood era, according to the Sumerian king list, began when kingship once again descended from heaven, this time at the city of Kish. The task of the new kings was to excavate the wisdom of the past. They sought to rebuild the temples on their original foundations and to recover the laws and technologies that had been lost. Archaeologically, this narrative finds a fascinating echo in the excavations of southern Mesopotamia. In the early 20th century, Sir Leonard Woolley discovered a thick layer of clean, water-laid silt at the site of Ur. Below this layer, he found evidence of an older culture that was distinctly different from what came after. While historians debate whether this specific layer represents a global flood or a series of severe river floods, the psychological impact on the ancient Sumerians was undeniable. They viewed their history as being split into 2 distinct halves, the time before the flood and the time after. Everything they built, every city they founded, and every text they wrote was an attempt to reclaim the celestial wisdom that had been salvaged by Ziusadra. The legacy of the Eridu Genesis is found in the way the Sumerians organized their society. They believed that their civilization was a replica of a divine model. The layout of their cities, the hierarchical structure of their government, and even the irrigation canals were seen as earthly reflections of heavenly realities. When they looked at the ruins of the older cities, they did not see primitive remains. They saw the golden age of the Anunnaki. This perspective fueled a culture of deep traditionalism and a reverence for ancient texts. To the Sumerian scribe, new knowledge was rare. True wisdom was the act of uncovering and interpreting what the gods had already revealed in the beginning. Furthermore, the Eridu Genesis established the archetype of the flood hero as a sage. Ziusadra was not just a survivor, He was the guardian of the divine blueprints. This theme would later be adapted by the Babylonians with Utnapishtim and by the Hebrews with Noah. In each case, the survivor is given specific instructions that involve the preservation of a covenant or a body of knowledge. The ruins of the Eridu Genesis are therefore not just clay tablets or physical debris. They are the foundational ideas that shaped Western and Near Eastern thought. As we examine the Sumerian records, we see that the Anunnaki left behind more than just myths of their presence. They left a framework for how to live in an unpredictable and often hostile world. The salvaging of celestial wisdom was a process of taking the divine gifts of the past and adapting them to a new, more difficult reality. The gods might have retreated to the distant heavens, but their me remained. Through the study of mathematics, astronomy, and law, the survivors of the flood sought to keep the connection to the celestial realm alive. The ruins of Eridu serve as a reminder that even when the waters of chaos wash the world clean, the traces of what came before continue to influence the shape of everything that follows. As the floodwaters receded and the mud of the Mesopotamian plains began to dry, a new era of human organization emerged. This period did not merely rely on the memory of the elders or the oral traditions passed down through generations. Instead, it was marked by the birth of a revolutionary technology that would forever change how humanity interacted with its own history. This technology was writing, and more specifically, the system we now call cuneiform. To understand what the Anunnaki left behind, we must look at the clay tablets that survived the rise and fall of empires, serving as the definitive ledger of a civilization that claimed its very structure was a gift from the heavens. The transition from a prehistoric society to a literate one was not instantaneous, but in the Sumerian worldview, the knowledge of writing was part of the divine package of civilization known as the Me. These were the fundamental decrees of the gods that governed every aspect of human life. When we examine the records of the first kings, we are reading the work of scribes who believed they were documenting a divine order established by the Anunnaki themselves. These scribes utilized a reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, creating a medium that, once baked or dried, became nearly indestructible. It is through these cuneiform echoes that the names and deeds of the first post-Diluvian rulers have been preserved for thousands of years. At the heart of these records lies one of the most significant documents in human history, the Sumerian king list. This text is not a simple chronicle but a profound statement on the nature of authority and the relationship between the divine and the terrestrial. The list begins with a staggering claim. It states that kingship first descended from heaven and was established in the city of Eridu. After the flood had swept over the land, the text explains that kingship once again descended from heaven, this time landing in the city of Kish. This phrase, kingship descended from heaven, is crucial. It suggests that the authority to rule was not a human invention but a mandate provided by the Anunnaki to maintain order in a world that had been nearly destroyed by chaos. The Sumerian king list is a fascinating subject for modern historians because of its dramatic shift in tone and scale. In the sections describing the period before the Great Flood, the reigns of the kings are measured in units called sars and nas, representing thousands of years. Some rulers are said to have held the throne for 28,000 or even 36,000 years. To the academic eye, these numbers represent a mythological or symbolic era where the closeness of the gods granted a longevity that is biologically impossible for modern humans. However, as the list moves into the post-flood era, the lengths of the reigns begin to decrease sharply. While the first kings after the deluge, such as those in the first dynasty of Kish, are still credited with hundreds of years of rule, the numbers gradually diminish until they align with the natural lifespans of human beings. This transition from the mythical to the historical is where the records of the first kings become particularly intriguing. For decades, many scholars dismissed the early names on the list as purely fictional. Yet, archaeological discoveries have begun to bridge the gap between myth and reality. For example, the list mentions King Enmebaragesi of Kish, who was said to have ruled for 900 years. For a long time, he was considered a legendary figure. However, archaeologists eventually discovered actual stone inscriptions bearing his name, dating back to roughly 2,600 years before the Common Era. This discovery proved that Enmebaragesi was a real, historical person. While the length of his reign in the king list remains a subject of debate, his physical existence confirms that the Sumerian records were rooted in a foundation of historical fact. The records tell us that the first dynasty of Kish was the primary power in the immediate aftermath of the flood. One of its most famous rulers was Etna, described as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and stabilized all the lands. The narrative of Etna is particularly revealing of the Anunnaki influence. According to the myths associated with his reign, the world was without a king, and the people were scattered. The gods, specifically the Anunnaki, deliberated on how to bring order. They chose Etna to be the one to carry the staff of kingship. His story involves a journey on the back of a giant eagle to the realm of the gods to find the plant of birth, highlighting the theme of a direct connection between the early monarchs and the celestial beings who oversaw the world. As we move further down the king list, we encounter the first dynasty of Uruk. It is here that we find the name of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous figure in all of Mesopotamian history. While his epic poem focuses on his quest for immortality, the official records and king lists categorize him as a builder and a ruler who fortified the walls of his city. Like Enmebaragesi, Gilgamesh was once thought to be entirely mythical, but most historians now accept him as a historical king of Uruk who ruled around 2,700 years before the Common Era. The Sumerian records describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a literal bridge between the Anunnaki and the population of Sumer. The scribes who compiled these records were not merely interested in listing names. They were creating a narrative of legitimacy. By linking the current rulers to a lineage that stretched back to the time when the Anunnaki walked the earth, they established a sense of continuity and divine right. This tradition of recording the names of kings served a dual purpose. It was an administrative necessity for a growing bureaucratic state, and it was a spiritual exercise in honoring the hierarchy established by the gods. The tablets suggest that the Anunnaki remained the silent overseers of this process. Every victory in battle, every successful harvest, and every new temple construction was recorded as an act of service to the divine masters who had provided the blueprints for society. The physical nature of these cuneiform records is also worth considering. Unlike the papyrus of ancient Egypt or the parchment of later European civilizations, the clay tablets of Sumer were durable. Even when the cities were burned in times of war, the intense heat often fired the clay, making it even more resistant to the elements. This has allowed modern researchers to recover hundreds of thousands of documents. Among these are not just the lists of kings, but also legal codes, medical texts, and economic receipts. These documents reveal a society that was obsessed with order and categorization, qualities that the Sumerians themselves attributed to the teachings of the Anunnaki. In the academic study of these records, we must also address the concept of the divine assembly. The cuneiform texts often describe the Anunnaki meeting in a council to decide the fate of humanity and to appoint kings. This celestial bureaucracy was mirrored on earth by the priestly class and the royal court. The records of the first kings show that the ruler was often viewed as the steward of a specific god. For instance, the king of Lagash was the steward of the god Ningirsu. The king was responsible for ensuring that the god was fed through offerings and that his house, the temple, was kept in magnificent condition. This stewardship was the primary duty of the king, and his success as a ruler was judged by how well he maintained the relationship between his city and its divine patron. The Sumerian records also introduce us to the idea of the transfer of kingship. The list often notes that a city was smitten with arms and its kingship was taken to another city. This movement of power was not seen as a random event of war, but as the will of the Anunnaki. If a king failed in his duties or if the gods decided it was time for a change, the divine mandate would be moved. This belief system provided a theological explanation for the rise and fall of different city-states, such as Uar, Uruk, and Akkad. It reinforced the idea that human history was not a series of accidents, but a structured progression guided by the unseen hands of the first masters. Furthermore, the records of the first kings provide a glimpse into the evolution of human law. The earliest known law codes, such as that of Uar-Nammu, were written in cuneiform and claimed to be an extension of the justice established by the gods. These laws were designed to protect the weak from the strong and to ensure that the social order remained stable. This focus on justice and law is presented as a direct legacy of the Anunnaki, who were often described as the judges of the living and the dead. By documenting these laws, the first kings were codifying the moral and ethical framework that they believed had been handed down from heaven. As we analyze the cuneiform echoes of the first kings, we see a picture of a civilization that was deeply rooted in its past while looking toward the heavens for its future. The scribes of Sumer did more than just write names on clay. They preserved a worldview where the boundaries between the human and the divine were thin. They recorded the transition from a world of gods and monsters to a world of cities and laws, all while maintaining that the foundation of their world was the work of the Anunnaki. These records serve as the primary evidence of how the first post-flood civilizations viewed their own origin, viewing themselves as the heirs to a divine legacy that began when the first king descended from the sky. The study of these tablets continues to yield new insights. Every time a new fragment of the king list is found or a new royal inscription is translated, our understanding of the first kings of Sumer deepens. We find that behind the mythological flourishes and the impossibly long reigns lies a sophisticated effort to document the emergence of human leadership and the birth of the state. The Anunnaki may have retreated into the shadows of myth, but their influence remained etched in the clay, a permanent record of the time when the first kings ruled by the grace of those who came from above. This legacy of writing and record-keeping is perhaps the most enduring gift left behind, allowing the voices of the first kings to echo across the millennia to our modern world. While the physical ruins of ancient Mesopotamia offer a tangible connection to the past, the most profound legacy of the Anunnaki is not found in stone or clay alone, but in the very structure of human civilization. Following the Great Flood, the Sumerian records describe a systematic restoration of order that was not merely a rebuilding of what had been lost, but the implementation of a sophisticated blueprint for societal organization. This blueprint encompassed everything from the layout of cities to the measurement of time and the administration of justice. To understand this inheritance is to recognize that the modern world still operates on the foundational principles established thousands of years ago in the Fertile Crescent. At the heart of this blueprint was the concept of the me. In Sumerian mythology, the me were a set of divine decrees or universal laws that governed every aspect of human life and civilization. They were described as physical objects or tablets that could be transported, yet they represented the essential functions of society, such as the art of the priest, the role of the king, the practice of music, and even the techniques of metalworking. According to the texts, these me were guarded by Enki, the god of wisdom, in his subterranean realm of the Abzu. The recovery and distribution of these decrees after the deluge were seen as the necessary steps to transition humanity from a state of post-diluvian chaos into a structured, functioning society. This suggests that the Anunnaki legacy was viewed by the Sumerians as a complete cultural technology, a prepackaged system of civilization handed down from a higher intelligence. One of the most visible aspects of this blueprint was the construction of the holy cities. For the Sumerians, a city was not merely a collection of houses and markets. It was a terrestrial reflection of a cosmic order. Each city was dedicated to a specific deity among the Anunnaki, who was considered the literal owner of the land and the protector of its people. The architecture of these cities was centered around the temple complex and the ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid that served as a bridge between heaven and earth. The ziggurat was the physical manifestation of the Anunnaki presence, a place where the divine could descend to interact with the mortal realm. The layout of these cities was meticulously planned, with the temple at the core and the city walls providing a boundary between the sacred order of the interior and the untamed wilderness of the exterior. This urban planning was not haphazard. It followed a geometry that historians and archaeologists are still attempting to fully decode, one that often aligned with celestial bodies and the movements of the stars. The mathematical blueprint left behind is perhaps the most enduring and quantifiable aspect of this inheritance. The Sumerians utilized a sexagesimal system, which is a base 60 mathematical structure. Unlike the base 10 decimal system commonly used today for general counting, the base 60 system offered unique advantages for complex calculations and divisions. This system allowed the Sumerians to divide a circle into 360 degrees, an innovation that remains the global standard for geometry and navigation to this day. It is through this Anunnaki-attributed math that we still measure our days and hours. The division of an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds is a direct inheritance from the Sumerian records. This choice of base 60 was not arbitrary. It was deeply connected to their observations of the heavens and their need to synchronize the solar and lunar cycles. By providing a mathematical framework that could bridge the gap between the terrestrial and the celestial, the Anunnaki blueprint gave humanity the tools to measure the universe. In the realm of governance, the blueprint introduced the concept of kingship as a divine institution. The Sumerian king list explicitly states that kingship was lowered from heaven. This was a radical shift in human social organization. Before the flood, power may have been decentralized or based on different social structures, but in the post-flood world, the Anunnaki established a hierarchy where the king served as the intermediary between the gods and the people. This was not merely about power, but about responsibility. The king was the shepherd of the people, tasked with maintaining the me and ensuring that the land remained fertile and the gods remained satisfied. This model of divinely sanctioned authority influenced every subsequent empire in the ancient Near East and provided the foundational logic for the divine right of kings that would persist in various forms for millennia. The legal systems that emerged from this period, such as the later Code of Hammurabi, were rooted in this idea that justice was a divine principle that must be upheld by the earthly ruler. The engineering of the landscape was another critical component of the blueprint. The Sumerians did not simply live near the rivers. They mastered them. Following the instructions found in the records of the Anunnaki, the people of Mesopotamia constructed a vast and intricate network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs. This was large-scale hydraulic engineering that required precise surveying and a centralized labor force. By controlling the flow of the Tigris and the Euphrates, they transformed a marshy and unpredictable environment into a breadbasket that could support dense urban populations. The irrigation system was a physical manifestation of the concept of bringing order to chaos. It required a deep understanding of slopes, water pressure, and seasonal cycles. This was not the work of primitive farmers, but of a society guided by a sophisticated technological template. Furthermore, the Anunnaki legacy included a comprehensive understanding of the cosmos. The Sumerian records show an advanced knowledge of astronomy that seems far ahead of what should have been possible for a burgeoning civilization. They identified the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, tracked the movements of the moon with incredible precision, and divided the sky into the 12 signs of the zodiac. This was not merely for the sake of curiosity. Astronomy was essential for agriculture, as it allowed for the creation of a reliable calendar to predict the floods and the planting seasons. It was also deeply spiritual, as the movements of the planets were seen as the movements of the gods themselves. The blueprint for astronomy provided a way for humanity to read the intentions of the divine by observing the celestial patterns. The administration of this complex society required a massive bureaucratic apparatus, which led to the development of standardized weights and measures. The Anunnaki blueprint ensured that trade and commerce could flourish by establishing a common language of value. Grain, wool, and metals were weighed using standardized units that were kept in the temples. This prevented fraud and allowed for the expansion of trade networks that reached as far as the Indus Valley and the Mediterranean. The records of these transactions were meticulously kept on clay tablets, creating the first historical archives. This system of standardization and record-keeping is the precursor to our modern global economy. It created a level of predictability and trust that allowed civilization to scale from small city-states to vast regional powers. Perhaps the most subtle but profound part of the inheritance was the shift in human consciousness regarding the nature of the world. The Anunnaki blueprint presented a universe that was ordered, measurable, and governed by laws. This was a departure from a world perceived as a series of random, chaotic events. By providing the mathematical systems, and the structures of governance, the Anunnaki gave humanity a sense of agency within a defined framework. People believed they could influence their destiny by adhering to the divine laws and maintaining the systems left behind. This worldview laid the groundwork for the development of science and philosophy, as it encouraged the observation of patterns and the search for underlying principles. In the centuries following the departure or withdrawal of the Anunnaki from active involvement in human affairs, the people of Mesopotamia continued to follow the blueprint with religious devotion. They did not see themselves as innovators, but as preservers of a sacred tradition. When a temple was rebuilt, it was often reconstructed on the exact same footprint as the original, following the ancient measurements. When laws were written, they were framed as a return to the justice of old. This conservative impulse was driven by the belief that the blueprint was perfect and that any deviation from it would lead to a return of the chaos and destruction of the Great Flood. Today, we see the remnants of this blueprint everywhere. When we look at a clock, when we use a compass, when we live in cities governed by a central authority, and when we participate in a global economy based on standardized rules, we are using the tools and systems first described in the Sumerian records. The silent inheritance of the Anunnaki is the very fabric of our modern lives. It is a legacy that has survived for over 5,000 years, transcending the rise and fall of empires and the shifting of borders. By deciphering this blueprint, we gain a deeper understanding not only of where we have been, but of the fundamental structures that continue to shape our future. The echoes of the Anunnaki are not found in the silence of the desert ruins, but in the ticking of every second and the structure of every law that governs our world.